All right, so let's talk about connectors, okay? Notice on the back of this patch bay, as well as this one, you're not seeing the back of the switchcraft, but it's basically the same thing. What you have here are DB25 connections, and that is a way of getting 8 channels in and out with one single connection. Example, you've got an 8-channel snake like this, ends in a DB25 connector like that. I don't know if that's going to get in focus, but I'll try. So anyway, that's that. So you connect that to there. And then these can go to whatever pieces of outboard gear you've got or whatever it is you're connecting. All right, so that shows us the DB25 connectors, all right? And so next up, you may say, well, Barry, what type of connectors does this have? This has what's called Bantam connections, okay? And so that is a really tiny little small connection, much smaller than a 1/4 inch balanced, but yet bigger than an 1/8 inch mini. And so what this does, it enables you to get way more input and output jacks in there because obviously the connector is taking up less real estate. So you can pack more punch inside these things. These things, for trivia, in case you didn't know, they were used for quite a few different things, but one of the most popular ways that most people know about are, it's back in the 20s and 30s and 40s when you couldn't call a phone directly, you had to go through a switch cable connector and they would connect this house to that house. These are the type of connectors were used. And they've lasted into our audio world. Whereas you compare that to a typical 1/4 inch balanced, here's a 1/4 inch balanced, and then there's that. Again, I'll try to get that into focus, but I don't know if I can or not. But you can see the difference there. So here's a 1/4 inch balance. This is a 1/4 inch balance to an XLR. And then, of course, this is, balance to balance. So you can go, plug to plug, okay? And then you may say, well, Barry, what happens if you've got a mic preamp connected on here? How do you get a mic into it without having to disconnect it and go on the back of the mic preamp? Well, it's really simple. You can either make them yourself or contact a company like Redco, or you can buy them pre-made. I strongly recommend Redco for customized cables. If you're not comfortable making them on your own, check out redco.com. That's where this particular patch bay came from. You'll save a ton of money if you go through those guys. Huge fan, have been using them for several decades. But here you've got an XLR going into a Bantam cable. And so I would just, if I had a mic pre-connected right up there as an example, then I'm going into the input. My microphone is connected to this. And now I'm going into the input of that microphone pre as an example, right? Okay, so you got the various cables. Okay, good. All right, I got to stop the video right here real quick because at the end of the day, this boy's got to make a little bit of money on this. I'm offering up a lot of things. I do a lot of reviews. I speak a lot about gear. I talk a lot about techniques. And hopefully that's helping all you folks out. And if I have helped you out and you do appreciate the work that I do for you, I need your help on something. I'm part of the affiliate program with Sweetwater, which means if you buy anything from a $20 mic cable to a $20,000 console and anything in between, I get a smaller cut if you use the link down in the description below. So just go down to the description of this video, click on that link over to Sweetwater. Just use that link, purchase anything on their site. I get a small cut of it. It's really as simple as that. It's what sustains this particular channel and keeps other people's opinions out of mine, okay? And I like that because you're always going to get a straight deal from me here, all right? So do me a favor. I appreciate if you use that link and help a brother out because you don't make very much money off of views on YouTube. Big misconception on that. So help me out by doing that. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Let's get back to Patchbays. Now, if you haven't figured it out yet, I've got a separate camera over here. I kind of switched to that right now to where you kind of get more of a close-up. You can see kind of what's going on here with the patch bay as I illustrate some various connections and everything. But I'm going to talk about the basic principles of a patch bay. The one part that probably most people don't quite understand, who's not had any experience with a quality patch bay, that is getting one with what's called normaling. And it gives you the ability to do normaling. And what that does is gives you the ability to establish how the routing internally is going to happen within the patch bay. And I'll go over that just in a second. On this particular patch bay, one of the things I like about the switchcraft, now keep in mind the switchcraft is way more expensive than the Redco for essentially the exact same thing. This is about half the price of the switchcraft, so kind of keep that in mind. But having the normaling up front does make things so much easier, where is on this particular unit, I'll turn it around, and hopefully you're going to be able to see that on the front. But there are dip switches and everything right through here that establish the normaling for each one of the connectors here. And you'll understand here in a second why normaling is so critical, and understanding that and how to properly connect up a patch bay. It's just not a matter of just connecting cables wherever you want. You can do that, but that is not an efficient use of a patch bay. All right, so let's talk about pretty much industry standards when it comes to dealing with a patch bay. Over here, what's understood is everything on the top. Now, understand I'm going from, in your view, right to left when ordinarily I'd go left to right, but hey, I'm on this side, so give me a break. So let's talk about this over here. Typically, what you want to set up a patch bay is everything in the top row. Now, there can be some exceptions, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But everything on the top row should be the outputs, all right? Representing whatever output you're connecting to it. In the same sense, the bottom row are your inputs. So for example, on this last connector here, this would represent the output of something. So let's say I've got the first 8 channels of my recording interface connected via, an 8-channel snake via DB25 to this unit. And I've got the first 8 outputs connected to the very back of this and representing 1 through 8 down here. And so now I've got 1 through 8 on my outputs down here below. And let's say, for example, I've got my first 8 pieces of hardware. Example, let's say I've got 3 compressors and 5 EQs. I'll just make it up. 3 compressors and 5 EQs. Well, obviously you want the output of that recording interface to feed the input of whatever particular hardware you're using. Now that's if you're doing it via hardware inserts, not if you're trying to track through it on the way in. I'll talk about that in a second. But for right now, this discussion is going to be about hardware inserts, which are what you're going to use the most in your patch bay, I would imagine. Certainly is my case here. So ultimately, I'm going to go out of that recording interface. Let's just say out of output 1 on the recording interface into input 1 of the first compressor. And then input 2, and then 3, and then so forth until all of the analog pieces are set up. So again, outputs here, inputs down below. Very, very important. So you're saying, okay, so if I've got my first 8 outputs of my recording interface right here, and the first 8 inputs of my outboard gear down here, then what's going to go in the next 8 section? Well, what do you think? So picture all the outboard gear down here is now going to be connected up here. So this represents the inputs of all your outboard gear. Over here in the next bank of 8 is going to represent the outputs of those 8 pieces, right? And then what do you think might be below that if you're using hardware inserts? Well, it's going to be in inputs 1 through 8 on your recording interface. So think about it. So I'm going to come out of my recording interface. That's going to be represented in this first jack right here. I'm going to wire that in. And let's just say I manually connected for right now for the sake of discussion. Right? So that now you can clearly see right there. I probably messed up my focus on this by moving it. But now you're going to come out of there going into there. That's what this patch cable is representing. So out of output 1 of the recording interface into input 1 of the first piece of analog hardware. Then over here in the next bank of 8, which is going to be down here, right? We're going to come output of that same EQ, that this is EQ1, right? So this represents the input of EQ1. Now the output of EQ1 is going to go over here, and it's going to go back into input 1 of your recording interface. So your first 8 outboard gear, your outputs of those are here, and then your inputs are down here. And that way, everything is wired perfectly already for you for doing hardware inserts. Well, you may say, well, Barry, why can't I just put that anywhere I want and patch it wherever I want? Well, you can, but now you've got to understand normaling. So let's talk about that real quick. Now, when it comes to normaling, you've got 3 types of settings. You have normaled, half normaled, and non-normaled. Now, there may be a few different acronyms that are used out there, but they all represent the same thing. So you've got normaled, half normaled, and then non-normaled. And what normaling means, okay, which the majority of your patch bay is going to be set up for normaled, not half normaled or non-normaled. It's going to be set up for normal. There are going to be some opportunities down the road I'm going to talk about where you would choose non-normaled, okay? So what normaling means is where I represented over here, I'm coming out of output 1 of the recording interface, and now I've got a physical wired connection going down to the input of the first compressor, right? So out of the interface into the compressor. Now this patch cable represents that. Guess what you don't need if you're set up normally. You don't need the patch cable. Automatically, when it's set up normal, whatever's in the top row automatically feeds the bottom row. So without you doing anything whatsoever, as long as you've got that particular channel set up for normaled, full normaled, right? You've got it set up for full normaled, then your output of your recording interface is going to automatically go into the input of your first piece of analog gear. In this example was a compressor. That is what's great about normaling. And so when I see a lot of studios, and either I see images or videos or I walk into one and I see they've got these patch cables all kind of connected up, and I asked the engineer, said, how often are you disconnecting those patch cables over there? Oh, never. That's our permanent wiring for all of this. And I'm thinking, you don't need all those patch cables. Why are you doing that? Why didn't you wire it right to begin with? Now, I said, wire it right to begin with. Stop what you're doing and listen to what I'm about ready to tell you. Well before you get into doing any wiring whatsoever of your patch bay, you need to map the entire thing out either on paper or in the computer. However, I do mine in Excel. I've got a template that I use in Excel, and I indicate how everything's going to be laid out. I label each one of what's going to go into each input and output so I can map that out and think that through in my head so that I've really got it thought out so I'm not having to redo anything when it gets time to ultimately start wiring everything. What you don't want to do is wire everything and then go back and somehow put it in your patch bay or create a cheat sheet or something, because the odds that you're going to remember all that are about slim to absolutely none, unless you're just a brainiac off the charts, of which this guy talking to you right now is not one of those. All right. And so ultimately, your normaling needs to be set up and established and how you're going to connect up your patch bay before you get started. So let's get back to normal. So it's full normal, right? Again, whatever's connected to the top row is automatically connected to the bottom row. That's where you can see the advantages of always having your outputs of whatever it is connected on the top and your inputs on the bottom. That way, when you go to someone else's studio, if they've done it right, it's very easy to figure out their patch bay very quickly, and so forth. So it's kind of a universal way of working, and everybody kind of should understand this. Well, Barry, what happens if I want to reroute something? Let's say, for example, I don't want to use the output for that particular channel, and whatever I may be doing right now, I want it to feed something else, which means I'm going to plug my patch cable in. And let's say I want it to go over and feed that input over there. Notice I went on the bottom, input. So I'm coming out of that input. What do you think? In full normal, do you think now this is also feeding this and this? Or did a break happen and the connection to the bottom row, which would be the input of the compressor, did that connection break because I plugged in a cable to the top jack, which represents the output, and go over here? Did it get rerouted to over here? Or is it going from here to here and from here to here? Well, when you're normal, the minute you plug a patch cable into either one of these, it severs the connection to the other, which means the minute I plug in this jack and this output of this first channel here, it is no longer going to send it to that bottom row. In this example, the compressor, it breaks that connection and now is rerouting it over here. Now, there are times you may not want to do that. Maybe there may be times that you want to test out two different compressors and see which one you like the most. That's where half normaling comes into play. If I'm half normal, now if I change the setting on here, if I change the dial to half normal or change my dip switches up here, now I'm half normal. So what that's going to mean is when I go to plug in, and I want to reroute that output. Now remember, I had 3 channels of compressor here, right? So I want to send that to the third compressor, right? So now I'm going output of output 1, and I'm feeding the third compressor. Well, when you're half normal, what you're getting in effect is an automatic Y cable to illustrate things. What it's doing is it is still feeding the output of output 1 down to compressor number 1, because it's half normal, it did not sever that connection. And it's also routing it over into input 3. So it's sending that same signal to 2 different pieces of hardware. So that way you can set one channel as your recording interface is to the input, which is going to be back up over here, okay, and record this compressor, and then bring it back in on channel 1, and that way, and you can go back and forth to see which one you like the most, okay? And so there's a gazillion other uses for it, but that's where half normal, when you want to be able to retain that connection from the top to the bottom, but also give you some rerouting abilities within it. So that is a definition of half normal. Again, full normal automatically takes it from the top to the bottom without any need for any connection, which is the way you're most likely going to use this the vast majority of the time. The times when you're going to break away from that is when you want to record on the way in, and I'll talk about that here just in a second. Lastly, of the normaling, you've got full normal, half normal, and non-normaling. Well, non-normaling is exactly what you think it is. There's no type of internal connection whatsoever. So, Barry, where would be a good use to have non-normal channels? It's easy. Microphone preamps. You take your microphone preamps. If let's say, for example, you've got 16 channels of microphone inputs, right? So you can take you can take those and connect those because you don't want those automatically connected, right? You're going to go non-normal because you're going to be able to route those wherever you want. You may need to route those into different inputs or things like that. Now, you could have it to where those 16 mic inputs automatically fed 16 inputs on your digital analog or your analog to digital conversion. You could set that up, and that's assuming that would be the way to do it if you didn't want to run it through any hardware on the way in. So when I'm talking about on the way in, let's say, for example, I want to take a vocal and I want to run it through an LA2A compressor on the way in. So what I'm recording has the effect of that compressor on it. I would need to reroute that internally. And so from there, that's where if I've got these on non-normal, I just route it to wherever I want. I come out of the output of that microphone preamp. Again, it would be in the top row of one of these. I'm only talking about the inputs where it would be non-normal, right? And so I want to send the outputs into input number 2, which may represent compressor number 2 as an example. But today you're bypassing that, and you're going to send that one into you're going to send that microphone into 2 as an example into that compressor. So that's the way you would do that in that situation. I typically set up my microphone preamps as far as the input is concerned to non-normal. Now my outputs, I can leave and give myself both options. The outputs can feed automatically in a normal situation. They can feed inputs on my recording interface if I have enough. But oftentimes if I'm tracking, I may not necessarily need to use all of the inputs for my hardware I/O. So I may route those microphone preamps to the inputs of my recording interface just while I'm tracking, and then disconnect that, and then that way they would go back to being hardware inserts, wired for hardware inserts. So I'm hoping that is making sense. Again, this shows how powerful Patchbays can be. Now there's tons of different types of Patchbays out there. I'm not going to say tons, but there's quite a few different options. First, you've got the 1/4-inch balance Patchbay, which is probably the most affordable Patchbay you're going to get out there, although I would argue the least durable long term, but certainly will get you through in a pinch. And there's a lot of those out there that are relatively inexpensive that give you the ability to set your normaling within it. And so you can consider that. Maybe you don't have as many pieces of hardware, so the number of input and outputs is not important to you. Then fine, go ahead and get one of those. They can be had easily for under $150. And so you've got that part. Next up, you've got your DB25 type, which is what you see here. Both of these are DB25. And all that does is just mean less cable. It's easier cable management when you're running to that, especially if you're running it into a desk like I have behind me, where you want to minimize how much real estate excess cabling is causing within the internal belly of that particular desk, okay? Then you've got some that are soldered directly. They come in and they're attached here and they're soldered directly to it. And those are typically used in professional long-term situations to where everything is just soldered in directly, and that way you get every cable down to the exact perfect length, and there is a ton of advantages to that. So you've got that option. You have digital options out there too. You've got Flock as an example, which gives you the ability to keep it all analog, but to be able to route all this digitally. That's very powerful stuff. Very, very, very powerful stuff. It's pricey though, and now you've got to consider that. Are you doing enough of it to justify the cost of it? Only you can answer that question. I've certainly considered doing it, but I'm not quite ready for it just yet. But then you've also got pieces like Craneborn, where you can incorporate your 500 series or any analog gear. It can be outboard gear, and you can route that all internally and reroute things internally and still keep it all in the digital domain. And so that's another compelling option out there as well. So lots of great options out there for figuring these things out. And I'll remind you again, if you're going to go to purchase any of these things, of course, Redco, you got to go directly with them. But anything else you may purchase, I would encourage you to use the Sweetwater link down below that I talked about earlier. It helps me out. And if you're going to buy something like that, help a brother out. I've kind of taught you about this stuff. So pay me back by, using that code and buy yourself something. So I get an itty bitty portion. Okay. Thank you very much. All right. So hopefully this has made this a lot more simplified. I've got videos out there showing, at least at one point, how I had my Patchbays wired and connected, and I show what I do in Excel and the logic and the thought process behind it. I think I've got 3 other videos on Patchbays, but those were early on in the channel, and oftentimes people don't necessarily go back to find things like that. So I thought, since I had all of this gutted, since I reconfigured my desk recently, and if you'd like to see that whole process, there's a video out that I did last week or so on that. I encourage you to go check that out. But I thought before I went and wired everything back up, I'd make yet another video on Patchbays, because I think they are an important part of a studio for the people who actually need one. Not everybody needs one, okay? So keep that in mind. Not everybody needs one. Sometimes it falls under just because you can does not mean you should. As you can see here, I have a need for that type of thing because I have 2 separate Bantam Patchbays here. And I fill both of them up I fill the Switchcraft up in probably about at least half of this one. Plus it gives me ability to grow later on down the road if I so choose to do so, okay? Until I choose to go a different route. Maybe at some point I'll consider Flock, but that's not today, all right? So hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully you've learned something along the way. And until next time, don't do me a favor. Don't forget to leave some comments down below. Tell me what you think. Ask any questions you have down below. Tell me any successes, failures you've had with Patchbays, and what do you think caused that? Let's just talk about it in general down below in the comments. I appreciate it. Know that I read every comment. I don't always have the time to respond to every comment, but I do read every single one of them. All right. So until next time, I hope every one of you have a great day.